The late summer heat in Oakhaven, Massachusetts, was a thick, stagnant blanket, clinging to the small, clapboard houses and the dense pine forest that caged the village. It was a heat that promised no relief, much like the rigid, unyielding atmosphere of the Blackwell homestead. Thomas Blackwell stepped off the train, the polished leather of his city boots immediately dusting with the fine, red Oakhaven soil. He inhaled the familiar scent of pine and decay, a smell he'd spent 4 years at university trying to forget. The world was rapidly modernizing, but Oakhaven remained stubbornly anchored in the past, ruled by custom and a silent, pervasive fear. Thomas was 19 but felt decades older, weighted by the pressure of returning home. He clutched his worn leather satchel, a vessel of forbidden knowledge, books on anatomy, modern philosophy, and most dangerously, psychology. The Blackwell house stood a mile from the station, a 3-story testament to austere puritanical ideals. It was tall, narrow, and painted a stark, unforgiving white. No flower beds, no porch swing, just a severe geometry that mirrored the soul of its matriarch, Elara Blackwell. She was waiting for him in the parlor, a room perpetually dimmed by heavy velvet drapes. Elara was a woman carved from granite, her face a mask of perpetual, tight-lipped disapproval. Her hair, the color of tarnished silver, was pulled back so severely it seemed to strain the skin around her pale blue eyes. "Thomas," she greeted him, her voice a low, dry rasp. It wasn't a welcome, but a declaration of his presence. "You are late. Purity demands punctuality. It shows respect for the order of things." "Mother, the train was delayed outside Boston," Thomas explained, trying to keep the frustration from his tone. The air in the room was stale, thick with the scent of age and starch. The polished wood surfaces reflected the meager light like dark mirrors, showing nothing but shadows. "Excuses are for the weak, Thomas. The strength of this family lies in its adherence to the law. Have you forgotten the lessons I taught you?" She swept her gaze across him, a silent inventory of his new suit, his longer hair, and the air of independence he now carried. She seemed to be searching for the slightest stain of the outside world on his character. She gestured to the parlor's only adornment, a hand-stitched sampler above the mantelpiece, its faded script reading, "Cleanse the stain, preserve the blood. The family must be pure." Thomas felt a familiar, cold dread settle in his stomach. He hadn't forgotten the mantra. He had merely begun to understand that the lessons were less about virtue and more about absolute tyrannical control. "I remember, Mother," he said, the words feeling dry and false on his tongue. He knew the futility of arguing. Elara saw dissent as impurity itself. His younger brother, Elias, drifted into the room. Elias was 16, slight, and deeply haunted. His eyes, large and dark, darted nervously around the room, settling on the deepest shadows in the corners. He wore clothes that seemed too loose for his frail frame, and his hands trembled slightly as he held a small, antique wooden bird, worn smooth by constant friction. "Thomas is home, Elias," Elara stated, her voice devoid of maternal warmth. Elias only nodded, his gaze barely meeting Thomas's. He looked fragile, like something that would shatter if touched too roughly. "Welcome back, Thomas." His voice was thin, like fragile glass about to break. Thomas immediately noticed the alarming difference. Elias used to be spirited, curious, a dreamer who sketched birds in the margins of his schoolbooks. Now, he was a ghost, a victim of Elara's intensified influence during Thomas's 4-year absence. "Elias, I brought you a book on ornithology. A special one with detailed lithographs. Remember how you loved to watch the blue jays?" Thomas offered, pulling the small, leather-bound volume from his bag. Elara's lips thinned further, a gesture that signaled extreme displeasure. Unnecessary distractions. Elias's time is devoted to meditation and reflection. He is learning to cleanse himself, to be pure. She emphasized the word with a chilling resonance. "The mind must be kept fallow, Thomas, not cluttered with the vanities of the outside world." That night, the house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old foundation settling under the oppressive humidity. Thomas lay in his childhood bed, the window open to let in the heavy night air. He couldn't sleep. The phrase, "cleanse the stain," echoed in his mind, overlaid with the image of Elias's terrified eyes. He remembered the vague, disturbing stories his mother told them as children. Stories of weak relatives, an aunt who disappeared after a scandalous courtship, a cousin who left town after questioning the faith. All had to be removed to ensure the family's survival and spiritual health. The reasons were always vague, always justified by the abstract, unquestionable necessity of purity. He rose, his intellectual curiosity and fraternal anxiety outweighing his ingrained fear of disobeying his mother. He had to find out what had happened in Oakhaven while he was gone, and more pressingly, what had happened to Elias's spirit. He slipped down the narrow, creaking staircase to the first floor. He found Elias not in his room, but in the small, rarely used library adjacent to the back hall. Elias was huddled on the dusty floor, illuminated by a sliver of moonlight, not reading but tracing frantic, repetitive patterns on the mahogany floorboards with a trembling finger. "Elias, what's wrong?" Thomas whispered, kneeling beside him. Elias flinched violently, clutching the wooden bird against his chest. His breathing hitched. "Shh. She'll hear. She always hears." "Mother is sound asleep, I promise. Tell me, you're scared. What is she doing to you? What are the purity lessons now? They're different, aren't they?" Elias's eyes, normally deep brown, were wide with a terror that seemed disproportionate to the quiet, closed environment of the library. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he pointed a shaky finger toward the heavy, locked cellar door that sat ominously at the back of the library. It was an access point Thomas and Elias had been strictly forbidden from touching their entire lives, always being forced to use the outside cellar entrance near the woodshed. "The Room of Shadows," Elias whispered, his voice thin and catching on the words. "The place where the stains go. She made me promise to watch it, to listen. I can't talk about what I heard." He was visibly shivering despite the heat. Thomas felt a cold dread seize his gut, a visceral reaction that chilled him far more than any ghost story ever could. The lock on the door was an antiquated heavy iron mechanism, fastened with a large brass padlock. He remembered seeing a set of keys hanging on a hook high on the wall in Ilara's bedroom, but attempting to retrieve them now felt like crossing a line he might not return from. The silence in the house felt heavy, charged with the unsaid. The mystery, the suspense, was now a palpable physical weight in the air. This was not just religious fanaticism or obsessive discipline. This was something far darker, something that had actively, systematically fractured his little brother's psyche. He placed a comforting, firm hand on Elias's shoulder. "I'm here now. I know you're scared, but I'll find out what's behind that door. I won't let her hurt you." Elias shook his head frantically, burying his face against Thomas's coat. "You don't understand, Thomas. The stain, it doesn't leave. It just gets buried. And sometimes, even if you bury it deep, it finds a way to scream." Thomas looked from the pathetic figure of his brother to the heavy, intimidating door. The return home was not a warm reunion. It was the chilling, suffocating beginning of a grim investigation. He wasn't just fighting his mother's oppressive traditions, he was fighting a tangible, horrifying secret that lay behind that locked door, a secret that had potentially consumed the lives of others deemed impure. The atmosphere in the house was suffocating, thick with unspoken dread. Thomas knew one thing for certain. To save Elias and perhaps himself, he had to unlock that door and expose whatever brutal, realistic truth lay hidden in the depths of the Blackwell family. If you enjoyed the chilling return to Oakhaven and the secrets of the Blackwell family, make sure you don't miss the next chapters. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you're the first to know when the full story is revealed. The next morning, Oakhaven was wrapped in the same oppressive heat, but Thomas felt an internal chill. He had slept little. The image of Elias pointing at the cellar door seared into his mind. Ilara, efficient and severe as always, oversaw a silent breakfast. She spoke only to correct Elias's posture or to comment on the lack of proper zeal in Thomas's blessing. Thomas observed his brother. Elias ate mechanically, his eyes distant, constantly checking the doorframe, as if the oppressive weight of the house might physically collapse upon them. Thomas needed information, and he knew he wouldn't find it inside the four walls of the Blackwell house. After breakfast, he announced he was going to the village to collect his other trunk, a plausible excuse. Ilara merely gave a curt nod. Be back before supper. The outside world is full of corruption. Do not linger where the stain might cling. The village of Oakhaven was a collection of about 50 homes, a general store, a church, and a schoolhouse, all huddled together as if for mutual protection against the surrounding forest. The people were known for their insularity and their deep-seated respect for tradition, a conservatism Ilara had weaponized. Thomas walked down the main dirt road. He noted the details of his surroundings, trying to ground the psychological terror in objective reality. The dust motes dancing in the heavy sunlight, the monotonous sound of cicadas, the peeling paint on the general store. The normalcy was a disturbing counterpoint to the terror he felt. His first stop was the general store, managed by old Mr. Abernathy, a man whose family had been in Oakhaven for as long as the Blackwells. Abernathy was sweeping the stoop. "Mr. Abernathy," Thomas said, forcing a cheerful tone. "Good to be back. The town looks settled." Abernathy stopped sweeping. His expression, initially welcoming, immediately tightened when he recognized Thomas and, more specifically, the name he represented. The change was swift and noticeable, a subtle shift in the air that spoke volumes. "Thomas." "Yes, we've been settled," Abernathy said, his gaze flickering nervously over Thomas's shoulder, as if he expected Ilara to materialize. "Heard you were away at college." "I was, learning much. I was wondering, Mr. Abernathy, about the older folks, my father's cousin Amelia. I recall she lived just down by the creek. I'd like to pay my respects." Amelia was one of the relatives Ilara claimed had left town 20 years ago. Abernathy's grip tightened on the broom handle. He refused to meet Thomas's eyes. "Amelia? Well, she was delicate, too much whimsy, too much modern thinking for Oakhaven. She moved, Thomas, out west, never wrote back. Happened sometimes." The explanation was too quick, too smooth, practiced. Thomas pressed gently, using his polite, educated demeanor. "She was quite close to my father, wasn't she? Do you recall which town out west? Perhaps I could write to her." Abernathy finally looked up, his eyes clouded with fear and a deep, ingrained weariness. He lowered his voice almost to a whisper, glancing around the empty street. "Son, some names are best left buried. Your mother, she has her ways. Respect the silence. It's what keeps the peace in Oakhaven." The cryptic warning was more confirmation than a denial. Abernathy was scared, not of Thomas, but of the force Thomas represented. Thomas continued his walk, pretending to be distracted. He noticed that as he approached, conversations between neighbors instantly ceased. Children playing in the dirt stopped and stared, their mothers quickly pulling them inside. The village was not just insular, it was actively fearful. He walked past the old, neglected cottage where Amelia was supposed to have lived. It was overgrown, shuttered, and looked abandoned for decades, not merely vacated. The windows were opaque with grime. Thomas circled the property, his boots crushing dry weeds. Near the back shed, half buried in the soil, he saw a small, unnerving detail. A patch of ground that had been violently disturbed and then haphazardly smoothed over, unlike the rest of the natural, untouched landscape. It looked like an old, clumsy burial site, perhaps of a large animal, or something more personal. He realized the severity of the situation. Ilara's purity wasn't a private family matter, it was a public secret, a community conspiracy of silence enforced by fear and perhaps the threat of violence. Later that afternoon, Thomas stopped by the schoolhouse, using the pretext of reminiscing with his former teacher, Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis was an older woman, kind but perpetually nervous. "Thomas, you've grown into such a fine young man," she said, genuinely pleased, though her hands fluttered anxiously. He maneuvered the conversation to his childhood. "Mrs. Davis, I remember my cousin, Samuel. He was a couple of years older than me, smartest boy in class, but always daydreaming. I haven't seen him since I was 10. Mother said he left to join the circus. He was so good with knots and tricks." Mrs. Davis's kind demeanor instantly evaporated, replaced by the same mask of guarded fear Abernathy wore. She wiped down her slate with undue force. Samuel was difficult. "A disruptive influence," she said, her voice strained. "He had too much fire, too much defiance. He needed a stronger hand." "And the circus?" Thomas asked, his heart sinking. Mrs. Davis avoided his eyes, focusing on a dusty map on the wall. "Thomas, your family is blessed with strong convictions. Sometimes those who are not strong must be guided elsewhere. It's a matter of preserving the legacy. You understand that surely. It is the only way to avoid the stain spreading." She was parroting the language of the Blackwell house. Thomas realized his mother hadn't just removed people. She had managed to rewrite the narrative for the entire village, making their removal sound like a necessary act of social cleansing or self-preservation. The suspense was excruciating. He was close to a terrible truth. As he walked home, the oppressive air felt heavier. The sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched from the trees and across the road like clutching hands. The silence of the villagers was not born of respect. It was born of complicity and terror. He knew he couldn't rely on anyone in Oakhaven. The village was an accomplice to Ilara's system of purity. The key to the mystery lay not in the fearful whispers outside, but in the physical evidence locked away inside the house, particularly behind that cellar door. The next phase of his investigation had to be a confrontation with the past, the tangible proof of what Ilara had done to those she had deemed stained. He felt a chilling certainty. The village was shocked, but not by what the Blackwells revealed, but by what the Blackwells concealed. He had to find the proof. Thomas returned to the Blackwell house, the dusk casting long, skeletal shadows across the porch. The atmosphere inside was tense, heavy with Ilara's silent disapproval. He had to be smarter, more subtle. Direct confrontation was futile. He needed tangible evidence, something that predated Ilara's complete control. His target became his late father's study. His father, Arthur Blackwell, had been a quiet, gentle man, overshadowed by Ilara, but a man Thomas remembered as deeply melancholic, often retreating to his study with a bottle of brandy and a somber expression. Since his death 5 years ago, Ilara had kept the room locked, claiming it was for preserving his sanctity. After supper, Ilara retired early, citing a headache, an unusual concession to weakness. Thomas waited until the midnight silence was absolute. He crept to his father's study door, a heavy oak barrier. He didn't have the key, but his father, a man of simple hobbies, had once shown Thomas how to open the simple lock with a thin piece of manipulated metal. Using a stiff wire he'd stripped from an old clock mechanism, Thomas worked the lock, his heart hammering against his ribs. The click was loud in the silence, a sound of transgression. He slipped inside. The room smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and a lingering faint scent of disinfectant. Ilara's touch. Even here. He lit a single kerosene lamp, keeping the wick low. The room was sparsely furnished, a heavy mahogany desk, 2 leather chairs, and shelves lined with antiquated legal volumes. Thomas went straight for the desk. The top drawers contained old correspondence and financial records, nothing incriminating. He systematically worked his way down. The last drawer on the right was locked. He used the wire again, the suspense thickening with every click and scrape of the metal. The drawer opened. Inside, beneath a stack of his father's tax receipts, Thomas found a false bottom. He lifted it, revealing a hidden compartment carved into the desk's solid wood. Inside lay 2 items, a small, tarnished silver locket and a slim, leather-bound journal. He picked up the locket first. It was heavy. With trembling fingers, he snapped it open. Inside, on one side, was a miniature portrait of a young man with a familiar high forehead and kind eyes. It was Samuel, the cousin Ilara claimed joined the circus. On the other side was a woman with fiery red hair and a mischievous smile, Amelia, the aunt who went west. They looked vibrant, full of life, not weak or whimsical. They were not strangers, they were family. Thomas's blood ran cold. His mother had lied, not just about their whereabouts, but about their very nature. They were not stains to be cleansed. They were individuals erased. He set the locket down and picked up the journal. The leather was supple, the pages yellowed. He recognized his father's neat, economical handwriting. He flipped to a random date from 20 years prior, a few weeks after Amelia's disappearance. The entry was short and harrowing. August 14th, 1882. The earth is softer tonight. I can barely look at Ilara. Her conviction is terrifying. She calls it necessary preservation. I call it a choice I cannot live with. She said the stain was spreading, that Amelia's free spirit was a direct threat to the boys' souls. She had to ensure the vessel was pure. I tried to argue. I pleaded for reason, for compassion. She simply showed me the shovel, told me it was my duty to uphold the family. The silence of the house is deafening. I have nowhere to turn. I will never forget the look in Amelia's eyes, not of terror but of utter cold betrayal. I failed her. I failed myself. I have locked away my conscience in this drawer because I cannot bear to face it in the light. Thomas gasped, the sound ragged in the silence. The psychological terror was no longer abstract. It was concrete, tied to a shovel and soft earth. Amelia hadn't moved. She had been murdered, and his father had been complicit, forced by Ilara's crushing will. He flipped through more pages. The entries were sporadic, desperate confessions. May 5, 1892. Samuel. He asked too many questions. He drew pictures of a world outside Oakhaven. He was becoming defiant. Ilara saw the seeds of rebellion and moved quickly. She said he would taint Elias. I was weaker this time. I made myself drunk. When I awoke, she showed me the empty space. She told me the soil must be turned deep for the roots of purity to take hold. I am a coward. She is a force. I pray the Lord grants me oblivion. The truth was a heavy, suffocating weight. Ilara hadn't just imposed a lifestyle. She had carried out a systematic campaign of murder against any family member who showed independent thought, calling it purification. The suspense was no longer about what she had done, but how she had done it, and more chillingly, why the village had protected her. He carefully closed the journal. His mother's conviction, the sheer ruthless certainty of her belief that she was an agent of righteousness, was the core of the psychological horror. She saw her actions as maternal duty. He returned to the present danger, Elias. His father's journal confirmed that Ilara viewed even minor deviations, whimsy, defiance, as existential threats, justifying fatal removal. Elias's current state of extreme anxiety and fear meant he was the next on the list. His quiet, nervous nature was likely seen by Ilara not as a state of purity, but as a precursor to emotional weakness, a stain waiting to manifest. Thomas slipped the journal and the locket into his coat pocket. He extinguished the lamp, locked the drawer, and slid the wire back into his own pocket. The room was dark again, but Thomas was illuminated by a terrible, clear purpose. He had evidence. He had names. The silent agreement of the village, the forced complicity of his father. It all pointed to a pattern of realistic, human violence masked by a religious fervor. He crept back upstairs, the journal pressed tightly against his chest. The smell of dust and old paper now carried the scent of blood and fear. He felt the weight of his father's failure and swore he would not repeat it. The fight to save Elias was a fight against the monstrous reality of their mother's warped mind. The cellar was the holding cell, the garden was the graveyard. He needed to understand the current ritual to know how to stop her. The heat finally broke the following night, but the relief was short-lived. A massive thunderstorm rolled in from the Atlantic, its arrival heralded by a sickly green cast to the evening sky, and a sudden violent drop in temperature. By 10 o'clock, the house was plunged into darkness. The only illumination the frantic, flickering bursts of lightning that momentarily exposed the gloom in stark, horrifying relief. The storm isolated them completely. The sounds of the torrential rain hammering the roof and the wind shrieking through the pines created a cacophony that masked all other noises, making any stealthy movement impossible, but also making any private conversation possible. Thomas knew this was a dangerous night. Ilara thrived on isolation and chaos. They gathered in the parlor, traditionally the safest place. Ilara sat ramrod straight in her chair, holding a candle. Elias was huddled in a corner, his fear amplified tenfold by the storm's violence. Every lightning strike made him jump. Every clap of thunder elicited a small, choked sound. "The world is angry," Ilara pronounced, her voice cutting through a brief lull in the storm. "It is rebelling against the necessary order, just as the impure heart rebels against the truth. We must remain steadfast." Thomas saw his opportunity. The roar of the thunder was a perfect cover. He went to Elias and sat beside him. "Elias, listen to me," Thomas whispered, his mouth close to his brother's ear. "I found Father's journal. I know about Amelia and Samuel. Mother lied to us. They didn't leave. She was responsible. We have to be very careful now." Elias shook his head, his eyes wide and vacant. "No, Thomas. Don't say it. Don't think it. If you think it, the stain will cling to you. She can see it. She can smell it. She's a woman, Elias, not a god. She used Father's fear to control him. She's using your fear to control you. What is she doing now? What are the lessons?" Thomas gripped his brother's hand, feeling the tremors of extreme anxiety. Elias finally broke, tears streaking down his dusty face. "The room, Thomas. She makes me go to the library door every night and listen. She calls it attuning to the silence. But sometimes I hear a sound, a faint scratching, like nails on wood, and a whisper, a low, desperate moan. She says it's the sound of the stain trying to escape. She makes me pray for its final cleansing." A cold sweat broke out on Thomas's back. The noise wasn't a ghost. It was likely a recording or a mechanism, something Ilara used to sustain the psychological torment and belief in a dark, active impurity. Just then, a lightning strike illuminated the room with the blinding intensity of a flashbulb. In that instant, Thomas saw Ilara. She was not looking at the boys. She was standing near the fireplace, holding the candle, but her back was to them. She was moving her hands in a strange, repetitive motion, a ritualistic cleaning. The lightning revealed her in horrifying detail. Her dress was pulled up at the sleeves, and she was scrubbing the wooden mantelpiece with a coarse brush and a small basin of dark, viscous liquid. She was scrubbing the wall beneath the framed sampler that read, "The family must be pure." She scrubbed with a ferocious intensity, her knuckles white, her face a mask of insane concentration, whispering the word cleanse over and over again. The light vanished. Then came the deafening clap of thunder. Thomas realized what he had seen. Ilara was pathologically obsessed with the physical removal of impurity. Her purity was not merely a spiritual concept, it was a matter of physical contamination. As soon as the light was fully gone, Ilara turned back, her composure instantly restored. "Thomas, Elias, bed. The dark is a testing ground for faith. Do not let doubt creep in like the storm's rain." Thomas guided Elias upstairs, his mind racing. Ilara was unstable, driven by a violent, delusional disorder. He needed to act fast. He was determined to find the source of the screams and the truth about the stain before Elias was irrevocably broken, or worse, permanently cleansed. He realized the cellar door was locked from the outside, meaning whatever was behind it was meant to be accessed and maintained by someone. The screams Elias heard were part of an active operation, not the echo of a past crime. The focus of the horror had shifted. The current situation was as terrifying as the past crimes. The storm subsided by dawn, leaving the air washed and temporarily cool. Ilara was up, moving around the house with renewed, unsettling energy, as if the storm had purified her. Thomas knew he had a small window of opportunity before she assigned them more chores or lessons. He managed to intercept Elias in the pantry, where the boy was listlessly arranging preserves. He immediately closed the door, creating a small pocket of privacy. The smell of vinegar and dried spices, a strange witness to their conversation. "Elias, I need you to be strong. Tell me everything about the Room of Shadows and the lessons. I know she makes you listen, but what else? Be specific. This is the only way I can help you, and the only way to make the screams stop." Elias leaned against the shelf, his eyes tearful and frantic. He was physically and psychologically exhausted. She made me go down there, Thomas, just once, about a month ago. She told me it was the final, most crucial lesson on purity. She gave me the key and said I had to witness the stain in its final hours. Thomas's blood ran cold. "What did you see, Elias? Tell me." Elias took a shuddering breath. It was dark. There was a single dim lantern. The room wasn't like a regular cellar. It was smaller, walled off. In the center there was a kind of high cot, a small bed with heavy leather straps. And on the wall, there were instruments, things for drawing blood, things for binding. And there was a woman, not Amelia, a new one. Martha. Thomas recalled the name. Martha Clay, a woman from the neighboring town who had been rumored to have had an illegitimate child. She had mysteriously vanished a few weeks ago. What was she doing? Thomas pressed, his voice barely a whisper. She was tied down. She was crying, Thomas, not screaming, just a quiet, hopeless crying. Mother was there, but she wasn't angry. She was calm. She told me that Martha had allowed a great impurity, the birth of a child outside the family's sanction, and that the stain was physical. She said the only way to cleanse the family's exposure was to remove the source of contamination, piece by piece, until the stain's vessel was empty. The psychological horror twisted into something far more tangible and sickening. Ilara wasn't just killing, she was ritualistically torturing and isolating them, believing she was performing an act of spiritual surgery. Did she kill her, Elias? I don't know. I didn't see the end. Mother made me leave. But before I did, Mother showed me something else. She took a small glass vial, filled with a thick, dark liquid, and she showed it to me. She said, "This, Elias, is the essence of the stain, the poison that attempts to escape. This is what you must guard against." And she made me promise that I would never open the door, but always listen. She said if I heard the stain trying to communicate, I had to pour a little of this under the door. Elias pointed to a small, unlabeled bottle of clear, acrid-smelling liquid kept on a high shelf next to the cleaning supplies. Thomas realized the significance. Ilara was using Elias as a psychological guard, a final firewall for her terrible secret. The screaming and scratching Elias heard were either residual sounds from Martha's ordeal, or a terrifyingly simple mechanism designed to keep Elias in a state of perpetual, subservient fear. "Elias, what did your mother use on Martha?" Thomas asked, the terrible question hanging in the air. Elias shuddered again. "Needles. She had a box of very long, thin needles. She told Martha she was drawing the poison out of her essence. She said it was only the beginning of the purification." Thomas took the small bottle of clear liquid from the shelf. It was probably just diluted carbolic acid, or some harsh industrial cleaner, not a poison. But it was the symbol of Ilara's power, the anti-stain that Elias was meant to use. "Thank you, Elias. You have been incredibly brave. Now I need you to promise me something. Do not go near that library door. Do not look at the cellar door. Do not speak of this to Mother. We are going to expose her, but we need proof that the village authorities cannot deny." Thomas knew the village's deep-seated respect for the Blackwells meant he needed undeniable evidence of a recent crime, not just old confessions. He looked at his brother, seeing not a victim, but a survivor who had carried a terrible burden. "You are not stained, Elias. You are strong. Now go back to your room. I'm going into Oakhaven again. I need to find the one person who might not be completely under the family's shadow." He knew the local law enforcement Sheriff Hemlock was a weak man loyal to Ilara's influence, but Thomas had to try. He had the journal, the locket, and Elias's testimony. Now he needed a credible witness or further official documentation to tie Ilara's past to her current crimes and stop her before she cleansed his brother. Thomas knew that presenting his father's journal and Elias's frantic confession to the local Sheriff Hemlock would be useless. Hemlock was a man of the old guard, deeply afraid of disrupting the social order Ilara so ruthlessly maintained. He needed independent, irrefutable proof that a crime had been committed. His plan was risky. He decided to travel to Havens Peak, the county seat 15 miles away, where the official public records were kept, less susceptible to Oakhaven's local influence. He borrowed the family's old horse and buggy, claiming he needed to purchase a special medical text unavailable locally. Ilara, distracted by her own obsessive cleaning and preparations, grudgingly allowed it. The journey was long and dusty. When he arrived at the stone-built Havens Peak County Courthouse, the air was cleaner, the people busier, and the sense of fear was absent. Thomas felt a surge of professional confidence, shedding the crushing psychological weight of Oakhaven. He made his way to the Hall of Records. He requested the old death and disappearance ledgers for Oakhaven, specifically focusing on the dates surrounding Amelia's 1882 and Samuel's 1892 claimed departures. He presented himself as a family historian doing genealogical research, a perfectly plausible excuse in 1902. The clerk, a bored, tired man named Mr. Thorne, eventually produced the enormous heavy volumes. Thomas's hands trembled as he opened the 1882 ledger. He had to be quick and precise. He found the entry for 1882, no record of Amelia Blackwell leaving, no forwarding address, and no formal missing persons report filed. He found a single death certificate for a stillborn child. Blackwell, dated 1 month after Amelia was supposed to have gone west. The cause of death was listed vaguely as complications. The space for the attending physician was blank. He then moved to the 1892 ledger, searching for Samuel. The same chilling pattern emerged. No record of Samuel joining a circus, no record of relocation. However, there was a record of a mysterious death. A transient male, age unknown, found drowned in the creek, identified only by a loose button from a specific type of coat. Cause of death: accidental drowning. The transient was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave. The psychological weight of the inconsistency was staggering. Ilara hadn't just made the family disappear. She had completely erased their existence from the legal record, relying on local complicity or incompetence. She had replaced their lives with ambiguous records that were either outright fabrications or cleverly disguised deaths. But Thomas was looking for something more recent: Martha Clay. She had disappeared only a month ago. Thomas flipped to the current year. He found the entry: Martha Clay, listed as voluntary departure, signed by her only living relative, a distant cousin. A note was attached, stating she had fled Oakhaven in shame following her illegitimate pregnancy. The document was signed, witnessed, and notarized in Oakhaven. The signature of the witness, clear and familiar, was Sheriff Hemlock. Thomas felt a cold wave of anger and frustration. Hemlock wasn't merely afraid, he was actively complicit. He had signed the document that provided Ilara with the legal cover she needed for Martha's disappearance, giving her a vital layer of protection against outside interference. This realization deepened the mystery. Ilara's power wasn't just psychological, it was systemic, woven into the fabric of the community. Thomas realized that simply having the journal wasn't enough. The Oakhaven court system was rigged. He needed to find a credible external witness to Martha's presence and then use the journal as confirmation of the pattern of behavior. He quickly copied down the official record numbers for Martha Clay and the stillborn Blackwell child, securing tangible evidence of the discrepancy. He paid the clerk and left, the heavy ledgers closing with a finality that spoke of justice long denied. Outside, the sun was bright, but Thomas felt the darkness of Oakhaven clinging to him. He knew he had to turn the evidence of past deceit into leverage against the current crime. He realized the only person in Oakhaven not completely under Ilara's control, the only potential witness, was Elias. But Elias was too fragile. Thomas decided to return via the old logging road, avoiding the village. As he rode, he saw a dilapidated farmhouse on the outskirts, clearly abandoned. He remembered his father mentioning that an old, eccentric man named Mr. Finch lived there, a recluse who often criticized the Blackwells. Finch wasn't a witness to the crimes, but he was an untainted voice. Thomas stopped the buggy. He needed an ally, someone outside the family's immediate influence who could speak to the atmosphere and the sudden disappearances. He had to use the journal to convince Finch, and then use Finch to pressure Hemlock. The key to the truth was still locked in the Blackwell cellar, but the key to freedom was convincing the outside world that the purest family in Oakhaven was, in reality, a cult of murder protected by a wall of silence and official deceit. He had the pattern. Now he needed the opening. Thomas returned to the Blackwell house, concealing the documents from the county clerk inside his overcoat. He had not managed to contact Mr. Finch. The man's farmhouse was too deep in the woods, and Thomas couldn't risk the time. He needed to confront Ilara directly, using the evidence to destabilize her control, but primarily to gauge her current state and her plans for Elias. He found Ilara in the dining room, meticulously polishing the silver. She looked up, her blue eyes sharp and assessing. "You've been gone too long, Thomas. The day's tasks are neglected. The stain of irresponsibility is already on your hands." Thomas walked toward her, holding the folded documents and the locket. The atmosphere was instantly charged with suspense. "I was delayed because I was collecting a different kind of record, Mother," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. He placed the locket on the table. "I found this in Father's desk. It has pictures of Amelia and Samuel." Ilara didn't flinch. She picked up a silver spoon and continued polishing it, her movement slow, deliberate, unnervingly calm. "They are images of the past. The past is weak, Thomas. It tried to cling to us, to drag us down with its compromises. Your father kept them because he too was weak." Thomas pushed. "And his journal, where he confessed that you forced him to participate in their murder, where he wrote that you showed him the shovel after you killed Amelia and that you made him complicit in Samuel's disappearance." Ilara paused in her polishing. She looked up, not with rage, but with an expression of profound, chilling pity. "Murder, Thomas. You use such crude, uneducated language. I am surprised your modern university taught you so little discernment." She put the spoon down, finally focusing on him. "I did not murder them. I performed a necessary excision. Amelia had the spiritual corruption of vanity and defiance. She sought a life outside the covenant, a life that would eventually bring shame and moral decay to our line. Samuel had the mental corruption of questioning, of seeking impurity through external knowledge. They were not people. They were vessels of contagion. A good gardener removes the blight to save the harvest. A good mother removes the stain to save her sons. Her conviction was a wall of terrifying certainty. The psychological horror was in her absolute belief in her own righteousness. And Martha Clay, the woman who disappeared a month ago, the mother of the illegitimate child, was she another vessel of contagion you excised? Ilara smiled, a faint cold movement of her lips. Martha was a lesson. I allowed Elias to see the consequences of impurity. The child was born in sin, a physical manifestation of a spiritual rot. I needed to show Elias that the stain is real, tangible, and that it must be systematically removed. He now understands the weight of our family's responsibility. He will be pure. "Where is she, Mother?" Thomas demanded, pushing the documents toward her. "Because the county ledger says she voluntarily left Oakhaven in shame. That lie was signed by Sheriff Hemlock. But I know she is behind that cellar door. I know you're torturing her, using needles and fear to break her mind, claiming you're drawing out the poison." Ilara's eyes narrowed slightly, a subtle flicker of concern, not at his accusation of murder but at his knowledge of the method. The man who holds the ledger only records what he is told, Thomas. And the sheriff, bless his soul, understands that preserving the order of the community sometimes requires a quiet hand. Martha's sin was a danger to everyone. She is receiving intensive treatment to help her understand the error of her ways. She is confined. She is being purified. This is not murder, Thomas. This is salvation. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a seductive maternal whisper, an act of pure psychological manipulation. You see the world in black and white, son, but I see the subtle, necessary shades of gray. I do this for you. I do this for Elias. I do this to keep the name Blackwell pure, strong, and respected in this village. Your strength will be your adherence to this sacred, necessary process. Now, put away your foolish papers and your trinkets. The hour of supper is approaching. Thomas realized the confrontation was a failure in terms of forcing a confession, but a victory in terms of understanding her strategy. Ilara was not just a murderer. She was a brilliant, meticulous manipulator who had managed to construct an ironclad legal and psychological defense using the local authorities as unwitting or unwilling accomplices. She had transformed realistic, brutal crimes into acts of community maintenance and spiritual purity. The mystery of what happened was solved. The suspense now lay in how to prove it and how to stop her next move. He had to secure the final physical evidence from the cellar before she finalized Martha's purification. The family's dark secrets are unraveling, but the true horror is still locked away. If you're on the edge of your seat, keep the suspense building by subscribing to the channel now. Your support helps us bring more chilling, realistic stories to life. Thomas knew he couldn't wait for Sheriff Hemlock or any other local official. He was isolated, and Elias was still in grave danger. He had to breach the cellar not only to save Martha if she was still alive, but to retrieve undeniable physical evidence of Ilara's systematic cruelty that would convince outside authorities. The main cellar door in the library was still locked with a heavy brass padlock, the keys still hanging in his mother's room, a risk Thomas couldn't afford. But Elias's description of the room and the overall geometry of the old house had planted a seed of suspicion. His father, a man forced into complicity, might have left an escape hatch, a way to observe or access the horror without confronting Ilara. After Ilara retired for the night, Thomas began his search in the library again. The lamplight was low, casting long, nervous shadows. He ran his hands along the walls, searching for any break in the plaster or paneling. He bypassed the obvious cellar door and focused on the wall furthest from it, the wall that backed onto the main staircase landing. He remembered a detail from his childhood. The wide, heavy molding beneath the library window was unusually deep, almost like a shallow shelf. He pressed, pushed, and knocked on the wood. Most of it sounded solid. Then, near the right corner of the window frame, a small 4-inch section of the dark wood paneling sounded hollow. He used the thin wire again, pushing it into the seam where the molding met the wall. He felt a tiny lever spring. With a soft click, the entire lower section of the molding, about 3 feet long, slid silently inward. It wasn't a door, but a panel revealing a narrow, dust-choked space. He shone the lamp into the gap. It revealed a cramped vertical shaft barely wide enough for a slender man. At the bottom, about 7 feet down, he saw a dusty wooden hatch. It was a secret, hidden passage, an inspection shaft or a secondary entrance to the cellar, clearly created long ago by his father as an emergency measure or a private means of escape from Ilara's tyranny. Thomas felt a mixture of fear and triumph. His father, the coward and accomplice, had left them a tool for survival. He had to get down there. He carefully secured the lamp onto a small ledge inside the shaft. He needed a rope or something to secure his descent. He went upstairs and retrieved a strong, thick clothesline from the laundry room, returning to the passage. He secured one end of the line around the base of the heavy desk and fed the rest down the shaft. He took one last deep breath of the stale library air. The psychological barrier of the locked main door was what Ilara relied on. This passage was her blind spot. He squeezed into the shaft, relying on the rope and the narrow walls for leverage. The descent was terrifying, fraught with the risk of making noise. He slid down, his boots scraping the rough wood. He reached the bottom, his feet landing silently on the wooden hatch. He knelt, using his wire to feel for a latch on the hatch. After a moment of fumbling, he found it, a simple hook latch, and slid it open. He pushed the hatch up and eased himself through, dropping lightly onto the damp earthen floor of the cellar, well away from the main access door. The air was heavy and cold, smelling of earth, mildew, and something metallic, like old rust mixed with fresh blood. Thomas drew the line of the cellar wall, moving slowly in the dim light. The cellar was large, mostly filled with barrels of preserves and dusty equipment. But at the far end, against the foundation, was the structure Elias had described. A small, separate room built of cinder blocks, unlike the rest of the old stone foundation. This was the Room of Shadows, the purification chamber. The room had a narrow, heavy wooden door, but unlike the one upstairs, this door was secured only by a basic exterior bolt. This was the room's inner entrance, accessible only from the cellar. He crept forward, his shoes crunching slightly on the fine grit floor. He reached the door and pressed his ear against the cold, rough wood. Silence. Complete, utter, terrifying silence. He reached out a hand and slowly, painstakingly slid the heavy metal bolt open, the friction making a sound that felt deafening in the stillness. He held his breath, waiting for Ilara to burst down the stairs. Nothing. He pushed the door inward, just a crack. The stench of disinfectant, old bandages, and human waste hit him like a physical blow. He raised the lamp he carried. The light illuminated the room. His heart sank, but his resolve hardened. The room was empty. The high cot with the leather restraints was there. The small table with the rusty-looking implements was there, but Martha Clay was gone. Ilara had completed her final purification. The mystery of Martha's fate had been chillingly resolved, but Thomas saw something else. Fresh, damp stains on the floor, and a small, tightly sealed glass jar on the table next to the restraints, labeled with a single, handwritten word. Essence. He needed that jar. It was the physical symbol of the crime, the grotesque proof Ilara had saved. He slipped into the room, grabbed the jar and a bloodied, discarded length of leather strap. Another undeniable piece of physical evidence. He didn't waste another second. He was already on a clock. He knew he had to get out, and he had to use this evidence to save Elias before his mother turned her full attention back to the final stain in the family. Thomas swiftly made his way out of the purification chamber and back to the concealed hatch. He was careful, silent, the glass jar labeled Essence clinking softly against the leather strap in his coat pocket. He scrambled up the rope, pulling himself back into the library, his mind racing to formulate the final, crucial step. He returned the library to its pristine, silent state, closing the hidden panel and securing the rope in his bag. He had to assume Ilara would notice the cellar bolt was open, but by then he had to be gone, the evidence already in the hands of the proper authorities. He woke Elias immediately, shaking him gently. "Elias, wake up. We're leaving. Now." "I was in the cellar. Martha is gone, but I have the proof. We have to go to Havens Peak and show the county prosecutor before Mother wakes up." Elias was groggy, but the terror in his eyes was immediate. "Leave? No, Thomas. We can't. She'll know. The stain will be visible on us when we try to leave the house. She'll stop us." "She won't. We are not stained. She is the criminal. Trust me. We'll take the buggy, go to Havens Peak. That's 15 miles and a different jurisdiction. We'll be safe there." Thomas bundled his brother into warm clothes, grabbed the satchel containing his father's journal, the locket, and the documents from the county clerk, along with the horrifying new evidence. They slipped down the stairs. The house was utterly silent, wrapped in the oppressive darkness before dawn. They were near the front door when a low, dry voice cut through the silence like a knife. "Where are you going, my sons?" Ilara stood at the end of the hall, near the parlor entrance. She was fully dressed, holding a large, ornate silver candle holder. She had been waiting. The sheer, chilling certainty of her control was more terrifying than any sudden scream. "We are leaving, Mother," Thomas said, positioning himself slightly in front of Elias. "The game is over. I have the evidence, the locket, the journal, and the details of Martha Clay's fate. You will face justice." Ilara didn't move. She looked from Thomas to Elias, her eyes radiating disappointment, not panic. "Justice? Thomas, I am the purveyor of justice, and you, my educated son, have just committed the ultimate act of impurity, betrayal. You have chosen the contagion of the outside world over the sanctity of your blood." She raised the candle holder, her face illuminated from below, making her look spectral and alien. "I watched you leave the cellar. You are clumsy, but you also confirmed my deepest fear, that the stain of weakness, of empathy, was rooted deep in your soul. You are not strong enough to be pure." She stepped forward, her voice rising in cold, fanatic fervor. "I thought I could save you, but the stain is too pervasive. The revelation must be made clear now. It's not just a spiritual rot, Thomas. It's a biological weakness that must be culled. All those who questioned, Amelia, Samuel, Martha, they were weak. They lacked the conviction to survive. They were the recessive, the unfit." Thomas realized the full, horrifying scope of her delusion. It was a terrifying, realistic combination of eugenics and religious zealotry, a brutal, self-invented philosophy of forced genetic purity. She was eliminating the family members she deemed genetically or psychologically weak to ensure the survival of her pure line. The stain was the natural human flaw she deemed an existential threat. "Elias, come to me," she commanded, her voice dropping to a hypnotic low. "Your brother is tainted. He carries the filth of the city. He wants to drag you back into the shadows. I will help you. We will perform the final purification, together." Elias took a hesitant step forward, torn between his fear and his brother's protection. "Don't, Elias," Thomas shouted. "She'll kill you. She'll confine you and use those needles until you're broken. Look at what she did to Father. She forced him to become a monster before he died of guilt. You are stronger than she is." Thomas pulled the glass jar from his coat. "This is the essence, Elias. This is the proof she uses to lie to you. This is what she collected after she confined and tortured an innocent woman. This is the culmination of her sick, bloody delusion." Ilara finally lunged, not toward Thomas, but toward the door, trying to cut off their only exit. Thomas reacted instantly, shoving Elias toward the door and throwing the heavy silver locket with force. It struck the candle holder, knocking it from Ilara's hand. The hall was plunged into blackness. "Run, Elias, to the buggy. Don't stop." Thomas heard Ilara cursing in the darkness, a sound of raw, desperate fury. He fumbled for the front door lock, his hands shaking. He wrestled with the antiquated deadbolt, the sound echoing in the confined space. A hand, cold and strong, grabbed his collar. "You will not leave this house a stain," Ilara hissed, pulling him backward with immense strength. Thomas, driven by pure survival instinct, brought his elbow back hard, connecting with her ribs. She let go, momentarily winded. He threw open the door and plunged out into the dark, damp morning. He saw Elias already scrambling into the buggy. Thomas sprinted, vaulting over the wheels, grabbing the reins. He whipped the horse hard. The buggy lurched forward, rattling violently over the unpaved road. As they pulled away, Thomas looked back. Ilara was standing in the doorway, a silhouette against the blackness, not chasing, but watching. She raised her hand in a gesture that was half curse, half farewell. She did not scream. She simply stood as the terrifying, pure monument to her own self-made evil. Thomas and Elias were speeding away from the house, carrying the evidence of the family's secret, knowing the full weight of their mother's human and realistic monstrosity. The long road to Haven's Peak was their only hope for safety and justice. The ride to Haven's Peak was a blur of fear and jarring reality. Elias wept silently, clutching the wooden bird while Thomas drove the buggy with reckless speed, the jar of essence rattling a grim rhythm in his pocket. The sun was just beginning to rise when they reached the outskirts of the county seat. Thomas drove directly to the county courthouse, not the sheriff's office. He knew the local sheriff was compromised. He asked to see the county prosecutor, Mr. Harlan. Mr. Harlan was a stern, sensible man in his early 50s, with the cool demeanor of someone who dealt only in facts and law. Thomas, pale and disheveled, poured out the entire narrative. The history of purification, the forced complicity of his father, the systematic lies, and finally, the disappearance of Martha Clay. Harlan listened, his face impassive, until Thomas placed the evidence on the desk. The county ledger records showing the discrepancies, the locket with the pictures of the missing family, the bloody leather strap from the cot, and finally the small glass jar labeled Essence. Harlan picked up the jar. He noted the dark, viscous contents. Mr. Blackwell, what is your mother's claim about this jar? She claims it's the essence of the stain, the poison she draws from the impure before their final cleansing. She uses it to justify her torture and murder, framed as an act of maternal necessity and spiritual cleansing. Harlan nodded, placing the jar carefully on a cloth. We will send this for immediate analysis. However, based on the journal entries and the documented inconsistencies you brought, we have more than enough grounds for an immediate warrant. Your mother has maintained a sophisticated years-long operation of murder and psychological terror, protected by local silence. Within hours, the county prosecutor, bypassing the compromised Oak Haven Sheriff Hemlock, organized a small, heavily armed contingent of deputies and the county coroner. Thomas and Elias returned with them, but remained safely at the county line. The raid on the Blackwell house was swift and decisive. Ilara was found in the library, calmly dusting the old volumes as if she were expecting them. She offered no resistance, only a chilling, quiet statement to the deputies. The stain is everywhere now. You have allowed the corruption to enter the gates. You will all suffer for your weakness. The deputies found the cell, the restraints and the instruments of torture, just as Thomas had described. The county coroner found no immediate remains in the house, but a full forensic investigation began immediately, focusing on the disturbed patches of earth Thomas had noted on the property. The next day, the news hit Oak Haven like a thunderbolt. The village, which had maintained its silence for decades out of fear and respect for the Blackwell name, was finally forced to confront the monstrous reality it had shielded. The villagers were stunned, not by the accusations. Many had suspected the truth for years, but by the proof. Sheriff Hemlock was immediately suspended and put under investigation for his signed complicity in Martha Clay's voluntary departure. The most chilling revelation came from the forensic analysis of the essence jar. It was not poison or a mystical brew. It was a mixture of human blood, distilled plant material and water, a psychological tool saved by Ilara as proof of her work. A gruesome self-made talisman that was horrifyingly realistic. In the weeks that followed, the search of the property yielded the grim truth. The remains of Amelia, Samuel, and others Ilara had deemed stained were discovered. The purest family in Oak Haven was exposed as a cult of murder, its crimes rooted in a realistic, terrifying obsession with control, and a warped interpretation of genetic and spiritual superiority. Ilara Blackwell never expressed remorse. During her trial, she maintained her position with chilling, logical consistency. She had merely performed a culling, an act of maternal duty to preserve the purity of her line from weakness. She was deemed sane, but convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder, her fate sealed not by mysticism, but by overwhelming physical evidence and Thomas's testimony. The aftermath in Oak Haven was profound. The silence was broken, replaced by shame, guilt, and a heavy reckoning with their collective fear. For Thomas and Elias, the journey was only beginning. Thomas used the small inheritance his father had left him to leave Oak Haven permanently. He did not seek to stay and become a hero. He sought to survive and heal. Elias was a long process of recovery. The psychological trauma was immense, but with Thomas's support, the boys slowly began to shed the layers of paralyzing fear. Thomas enrolled Elias in a good school outside the county and focused on encouraging the things his mother had suppressed: art, science, and independent thought. The wooden bird, once a source of comfort in his fear, became a symbol of his hard-won freedom. Thomas and Elias stood on the train platform, preparing to leave the state. Thomas looked at his brother, who was sketching a blue jay in his new notebook, a faint, genuine smile on his face. The terror was a scar, but the bond between them, strengthened by shared trauma and mutual protection, was the only pure thing to emerge from the darkness. They were survivors, bearing witness to a realistic horror, that the most shocking evil is often the most human, carried out with calm, meticulous, and utter conviction. The family was broken, but the sons were, at last, truly free.